All right, welcome. Let's talk Minnesota Wild. They're in kind of a scenario called cap hell with the Parise and Suter buyouts. Yeah, we know all of this. The cap penalty increases for the Wild $2 million this offseason to $14.7 million. That's a lot of money off the cap. The cap is expected to rise about $1 million. We don't have an official confirmation on that, but it should rise at least $1 million. They're going to have some tough moves to make. They're really going to have to start defining what type of season they're going to have next season, whether it's a type of retool or a season of mediocrity. And we'll dive into it. Let's get started. Unrestricted free agents that are pending. Gustav Nyquist, cap hit of $5.5 million. Oscar Sundqvist, cap hit of $2.75 million. Ryan Reeves, cap hit of $1.75 million. Matt Dumba, cap hit of $6 million. And John Klingberg, cap hit of $7 million. Right off the bat, Klingberg is probably gone. Wild can't afford him, and he's also not necessarily built to sustain success with the Wild. He'll probably go to a playoff contender, maybe a 1 to 2 year deal on a cheap deal, do his whole prove himself again contract, and we'll see how that goes. I don't think it's going to be with the Wild. Dumba, it just comes down to money. The Wild can't afford to keep Dumba. They just can't. It's a great fit. It's a great mix. Dumba is great in the locker room. He's great with the community. Unless he's going to take close to a league minimum contract, there's no way Dumba stays, and it's sad. But it could be a positive. It's hard to lose a guy like Dumba. It really is. He does so much for that organization, so much for that team, so much for that locker room. And he showed up in the playoffs, and not many players can say that on the Wild. Dumba was one of them that showed up and played exceptional. So the Wild would obviously love to keep him, but it could be one of those blessing in disguise things. You got to change up the decor to an extent. Most of the guys are coming back and have no movement clauses, which we'll get to. So Dumba, probably odd man out. Brock Faber looks great, probably takes his spot. Ryan Reeves, good physical body. Get him at league minimum or close to league minimum. I say you keep him. You have a lot of young guys. You have a lot more younger guys coming into the lineup. You kind of need that reinforcement to protect those younger players, so they're not getting abused and thrown around and discouraged. Reeves is a great player at that. Oscar Sundqvist, I don't really know. I think he's good for 10 to 14 goals for a team a year on that third or fourth line role. I don't know. I think it's kind of, you can only have so many depth players on your team, and the Wild have a lot of depth players, not so much top six players, and that's not what Sundqvist brings. And he might be expensive for, what else they could, he might be expensive in comparison to what else the Wild could explore for the same position. And maybe similar production, maybe not quite as good production. Sundqvist will get a decent paycheck. It's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be above $2.75 million. Could be. I've been surprised before. But I don't think the Wild pay over like $1.5 million for Sundqvist. Nyquist, now this guy fit in so well in Minnesota, and he's very grateful for Bill Guerin, the Wild GM, to bring him in and play him. He also didn't see top 6 minutes, and he was probably the best forward on the Minnesota Wild throughout the playoff series. He played very well. Still couldn't get out of that third line role, so that might be a bit of a turnoff for him, and rightfully so. But I think if you're the Wild, you want to keep this guy. He's a consistent 50-ish point producer, maybe more if he's playing with guys like Boldy or Kaprizov. Obviously, he has to take some type of discount. He's not going to be making $5.5 million next year. He might on the market, just given what he did in the playoffs, but that's the biggest guy the Wild should be aiming to re-sign in the offseason at this point. They've already re-signed Gaudreau. They re-signed someone else? And Johansson. Restricted free agents, Sam Steele. It's give and take. Depth forward, I don't know. I think it's 50-50 if he gets re-signed. I don't think he's going to get offer sheeted, so we'll see if Steele gets an offer sheet from the Wild. Then he'll probably stick around for about a similar contract. If he's released like he was from the Ducks, he'll hit free agency. DeHame, I like Duhaime. I think he needs to get re-signed. I think he's pretty cheap, maybe a $1.5 million contract. He can play on the third line if you need him to. He showed potential and an extra level to his game when he's been bumped up off of the fourth line. Nonetheless, a very good fourth line player. I don't know how much offensive upside there is with him. Physical player, gritty. He's a great player, especially a value player. Mason Shaw. Now, history of knee injuries. This was known before he even came into the NHL. Mason Shaw, you find a way to re-sign him. You take that risk, if you want to call it a risk. You sign him close to a league minimum contract. He's one of those guys that produced points in the AHL, produced pretty well in the AHL. There's offensive potential with Mason Shaw that is kind of yet to be seen or recognized at the NHL level, but it's there. Also extremely good on the penalty kill, like exceptional penalty killer. Very useful player. You find a way to re-sign him. Kalen Addison, I don't know. I think logically they re-sign him. Maybe $1.5 million, $2 million, probably more than you would want to pay for Addison. But I think they play him up his value and trade him. I don't think Addison and the Wild necessarily fit together as seamlessly as was expected. He's very good on the offensive side of the puck. Defense needs a little bit of work. Gets a lot of critiques and criticisms from the coach, Dean Evison. Was a healthy scratch nearly every game after the All-Star break. Not every game, but pretty close. So we'll see what happens with Addison and the Gus Bus in net. Gustafsson was awesome. I think he is the guy you need to re-sign. Nyquist's biggest unrestricted free agent of all the free agents, it's the Gus Bus. You find a way to re-sign him. You can still do it at a fairly cheap contract. Maybe like a $3 million contract for the next 2 years until you're out of the Parise Suter buyouts, and you can pay him starter money if you need to, or when Wallstedt comes up, their number one goalie prospect, maybe he moves on, or you trade Gustafsson for, I don't know, like a overall pick or something, or first round pick, not first overall. You have options, but I think you need to re-sign Gustafsson because he has market value, and he's your number one goaltender. You have Fleury on a full no movement clause for 1 year, $3.5 million. Kind of hurts the cap a little bit. Fleury's definitely a backup at this point. He's a backup to Gustafsson. You got to find a way to keep your number one goaltender. And I think this is the period where you can do it for cheap with Gustafsson. This was his breakout year. Before that, didn't really show didn't show number one starting goaltender potential. Really didn't in Ottawa. So this is the time. Sign Gustafsson. No movement clauses. Now Zuccarello has a 10-team no trade list. So he writes down a list of 10 teams he doesn't want to go to, and the Wild can trade him to the other 21 teams. Because the Wild are a part of that 22. So you could trade Zuccarello. I kind of like the option of trading Zuccarello. $6 million cap hit. Kaprizov got hurt last year. Zuccarello was, I don't know, doing Zuccarello things, turn the puck over. He wasn't great. He just wasn't. The playoffs come. He had a really good game, but it was just one, and the rest of the series, he was not good. He was not a top-line player. He's not a top-six forward. He's 35-ish. You can trade him to, I don't know, a rental team or something. He has 1 year left on his contract. You can trade him as a rental, maybe at the deadline. Maybe you get a first-round pick back. We'll see. But I think you got to explore options to trade Zuccarello. Yes, him and Kaprizov are buddies. That's understandable. But Zuccarello's not going to play until he's 40 when the Kaprizov contract runs out, or 39 I think he'll be when the Kaprizov contract runs out. They're not going to be line mates for much longer. So you got to start transitioning to the next first line right winger. That isn't Zuccarello, and I think now is the perfect time. You have an excuse. So Zuccarello, for me, if I was the Wild GM, Zuccarello would be on the trade block. It's also one of those guys that Dean Evison really likes and really refuses to take him off of that first line. And it's understandable in the past because Zuccarello's had some exceptional games, played exceptionally well, but most of those were with Kaprizov. The chemistry is great, but when he's not there, he's still a first-line player. When Zuccarello doesn't really show up to play or play well, he's still put on that first line. I almost feel like you need to take that away from Dean Evason, force him to make different adjustments, try different guys, see what works, and see what doesn't. So, full no trade clauses. The next three are defense and then goalie. Spurgeon, full no trade clause. He's not going to waive that, and I don't blame him. Norris candidate every year, not top 3 finalist, but top 10 in Norris voting typically most years. Spurgeon's excellent defensively. For a Norris caliber defenseman and his $7.5 million cap hit, which raised eyebrows when it was signed, it's a pretty reasonable contract. So, great. Brodin, full no trade clause. I don't see him going anywhere. Brodin is he's definitely the most underrated defenseman. I don't know, underrated. Wild fans know how good Brodin is, but the rest of the NHL may underrate him a bit. Brodin is an excellent defensive defenseman. I can't say enough good things about Brodin, but I think he stays, and his cap hit of $6 million is fantastic. Next up, Goligoski. No trade clause. Unlikely he'll waive it. This is his retirement job, if you want to say. Depth, 7th defenseman. Can play those minutes. Minnesota guy. He's not going to waive that no trade clause. And, I don't blame him. He has a no trade clause. Why would you trade it? You're getting paid. You get to be at home. No hate for that. Fleury, also not going to waive it. He's made it pretty clear. He's coming back for next year. He's not going to waive it. He doesn't want to keep moving around, which is 100% understandable. Going from Pittsburgh to Vegas to Chicago to Minnesota, kind of all over the country there. So a lot of these guys, I think the only guy you can really explore trading or requesting the no movement clause waive is Zuccarello, and I don't think you need to waive his clause. Other guys that might be talked about probably to relieve some cap space or to trade, or maybe just to build up the future. First one I got is Marcus Foligno. Yes, he's a leader. Yes, he's a physical player. There's a lot to like about Foligno, and it kind of breaks my heart to even have this on the board. But the Wild are in cap hell. They need to utilize every single dollar they can. And Foligno's contract for what he provides is probably a little too high. He had a career year. He was a 20-goal scorer a couple seasons ago. That's not sustainable. Had a very down year offensively this year. I think he's somewhere in the middle, honestly, offensively. But I think this is a contract you can trade, especially to a contending team that needs to bulk up and get more physical and maybe has a little bit of cap space to spare. He might be one of those rental players at the trade deadline next year. Honestly, if the Wild season doesn't go that well, if they're not really a playoff team, I could see them selling a lot of these players off as rentals, and I don't think that's a bad thing for the Minnesota Wild or their fans, to be honest. And we'll get to that. Next up, you got Ryan Hartman. Now, Ryan Hartman playing first-line center minutes, putting up points. Yes, he's an up-and-down player, but he has 1 year left at a cap hit of $1.7 million. The Wild probably can't afford to re-sign him. He's going to command a pay raise. That is one guy that's on a great contract and has a lot of value on the market. That is a guy you can get a lot back for. Ryan Hartman. I don't want to see him gone. I think he fits Dean Evason's mold pretty well and has done very well. He kind of found his career in Minnesota. I think it's a good match. I would hate to see him gone. I'd hate to see all these guys gone, or all three of the guys I have listed. But, it's going to happen. It could happen. It's very, potential. John Merrill, 2 years left, $1.2 million, depth defenseman. Merrill at this point, a third line defenseman / 7th depth defenseman. Maybe he gets traded to a team that needs depth defense. I don't know. I think he's pretty untradeable. I think you have to package maybe a pick in or something. Maybe even like a third-round pick for next year, because you'll see the Wild don't have a third-round pick this year. I also don't think you want to give out picks that are too high, because those hold value a little better. But the Wild could also trade picks and prospects, and we could see what happens. I'm really curious about how Bill Guerin approaches this draft. Historically, he doesn't usually give up a lot to move up in the draft, which is pretty understandable, especially because you can find a lot of steals later in the draft, especially with this being a deep draft, as they say. But it's also a unique one. They have a bunch of Russian players. They have Kaprizov. They have Vladimir Firstov, who's playing in the KHL. I don't remember how to say his name. I did a few months ago. Kondisov. He's an unsigned prospect playing in the KHL, and he is going off. They have a lot of KHL prospects that look like they're at or just about NHL ready and could be top 6 forwards. They're all forwards, as far as I'm aware. There might be more Russians. There's probably more Russians, but that's not the point. So this could, we could see some crazy thing happen, and I don't have any insider information, but we could see the Wild trade up in the draft to get a guy like Michkov. They have a lot of picks. They could trade their first and maybe a second round pick. I don't know. This is forward thinking. They have a lot of prospects. Last season, they had the number 1 prospect pool in the NHL as rated per The Athletic. They have a lot of pieces to really make a splash at this draft year. And do they get a guy like Michkov? I don't know. Obviously, he's not going to join the team for several years. Kind of follow the Kaprizov path. But when he's there, and maybe he plays with Kaprizov, that could be a dangerous line. Or maybe you split it up. You kind of have the what Boston did with Pastrnak. You move one of those guys down to the second line, and now you have 2 elite scoring lines. I don't know. I'm just saying. There's potential there. This is long-term forward thinking, but the Wild's cap penalties, you have to think about the future. I don't know that you're necessarily planning for 4 to 5 years in advance. Or was it 3 years? I think his contract expires in 3 years in the KHL. I don't know. I think it might be worth a risk and might be worth looking into. Obviously, no insider information. Purely being skeptical right here. I don't know. Words are hard. But I'm just saying. There's potential there to make a splash. If the Wild want to do it, they can do it. Now would be the time to continue to build up your young prospect pool. Build up these guys so they're NHL ready when those buyout penalties come off your books. Guys that are going to be kept, though, probably through the entire year this upcoming season. Now, it's Kirill Kaprizov. He's the superstar. Signed at $9 million. Honestly, a pretty good contract at this point. If he was on open market today, he would command probably 11.5, 12. Probably 12 or higher. Eriksson Ek, dude is your best center. You don't have center depth. He's a great two-way center. Great in his own zone. Great defensively. He's a very versatile player. He gives you grit. He's got a high shooting percentage in those high-danger scoring areas. Eriksson Ek is a player you got to keep, in my opinion, especially on that long $5.25 million contract. I don't even know when it expires at the end of the 2028-2029 season. This player gets better with age. I don't think you trade him, especially at that cap hit. He's one of those guys you keep. Freddie Gaudreau, Marcus Johansson, you both just signed extensions to those players. You usually don't trade players you extended in that first year. Gaudreau, again, center depth, I guess. And Dean Evison really likes Gaudreau. Johansson played really well with Boldy. Boldy's extension kicks in this year, $7 million for a 7-year cap hit. And Middleton. Middleton's a top-line defenseman playing top-line minutes and hasn't looked out of place doing it. Very good defensive defenseman, got the sweetest mustache, and it is on a reasonable cap hit. Was it $2.45 million? Let me check. $2.45 million. And he signed through the end of the Parise Suter buyouts. It's a guy you keep. That is just a guy you keep. That's a very good value player. Yeah. All right, let's get into it. Picks. Kind of talked about this a bit. They got first round pick, 2 second round picks. One of them is Vegas, and one of them is their own. And they have a 5th, 6th, 7th. So they have no 3rd or 4th round picks. Honestly, that's not too bad. The 2 second round picks, I think, is going to be a little underrated. I think, typically in deeper drafts, there are hidden gems in that second round. So that increases your chances of getting an NHL caliber player or a top 6 forward or a superstar. Again, Bergeron, Marchand both came out of the second round. Plenty of people come out of the second round that are excellent NHL players. The chances are lower because it's the second round as opposed to the first round, but nonetheless, it's there. Cap space this offseason, they have $8.2 million in cap space. They have 6 roster spots they need to fill. So you figure $1 million per roster spot, which isn't going to happen because some of these players, like the goalie, are going to command more money. You're talking pretty tight cap space. So they need to fill a goalie. All they have is Fleury signed. Their 2 depth guys, Hunter Jones and Zane McIntyre, are both unrestricted free agents. They'll sign a depth goaltender. That'll be on the AHL books. That won't really affect their cap space. But, they only have Fleury to play in the NHL. So they'll probably have to re-sign Gustafsson, and that's great. Defensemen, with Brock Faber, they have 6 defensemen signed on their roster. They need 1 more. Remember, 2 of those guys are Merrill. I don't even know where they are. Merrill and Goligoski. So you have 2 depth defensemen on your blue line that are signed of those 6. So we'll see what they do. They need 4 forwards, and a lot of these are pretty cheap, right? You got Shaw and you got Duhaime, and you can sign Steele. But you also have Marco Rossi in the AHL, who's should be a full-time NHL player next year. You got some AHL guys that could come up. I kind of wish we saw more of Michael Chafee. He was hurt most of this year in the AHL affiliate Iowa Wild, but he puts up some pretty good numbers in the AHL. You have Sammy Walker. You have a bunch of guys in the AHL who should begin to make that step into the NHL and be full-time players. We've seen a few of these guys start to trickle in the past couple of years, which is great. Duhaime, there's a bunch of guys. I'm not going to go through the list. But you have some of these younger guys now that are just about ready to be NHL players and should be in the NHL pretty regularly. Obviously, it's a different animal. Some players won't thrive in the NHL as opposed to the AHL. But you have to start trying them out. And I think that's kind of where next year comes into play. You got to play the young guys. If I'm the Wild GM, and I'm not, so I could be wrong, but I think you really start to develop this team. You develop the prospect pool, that young talent. You get these guys into the NHL roster. You see what they can do. I don't think this should be a year to go for it. I don't think this should be a year to even aim for the playoffs. Obviously, when the team is out on the ice, they want to win every game, and they should try to win every game. But if you're playing a lot of the younger guys, you're probably not going to win every game. So that's what I want to see from the Wild this year. You need these young guys to step in and be productive. You need to see what you have in the AHL, in your prospect pool, that can play in the NHL. You need to start thinking about the future. A little bit happened this past year, but this is the year where you really start to have to think about that. The cap will go up next year, so you can worry about re-signing or being competitive next year depending on where you are. But for this upcoming season, you got to start playing the younger guys. Marco Rossi's got to be a full-timer in the NHL. You got to see what he can do over an 82-game schedule. You got to see how he develops as the season goes along. He might get off to a slow start. That's fine. But if he finishes the season strong, that's encouraging. If he doesn't, that's not encouraging. You also have to factor in where he plays. Is he going to get top-line minutes? Is he going to play with a guy like Kaprizov on a regular basis, or Matt Boldy, who he has chemistry with from previous Iowa Wild days? What's his success going to look like? You have to start developing these young guys. This is the year. A year of mediocrity isn't ideal. And if you miss the playoffs, you get a higher draft pick, which isn't really a bad thing. You're bringing some of these guys up while replenishing your prospect pool with high-end talent. So kind of a double-sided coin there. The Wild are really intriguing with these buyouts. It's impressive what Bill Guerin's done to navigate this. He really didn't give up much for some of these guys at the deadline, like Nyquist, Sundqvist, Klingberg. Again, rental players, but really didn't give up a whole lot for that. What was it? The Hathaway Orlov deal from the Washington Capitals to the Bruins. The Wild helped broker that deal, got a 5th round pick. That 5th round pick was in exchange for Gustav Nyquist. Right? So, Bill Guerin, I have trust in Bill Guerin. I do not know better than Bill Guerin, and I can confidently say that. But we'll see. Again, rebuild. Don't rebuild. I don't really want to call it a rebuild. It's really not a rebuild. It's not even. I wouldn't even call it a retool. Kind of just getting those young guys into the lineup. Let me know what you guys think. You have different opinions. Should they go for it? Do you want to see a playoff berth by the Wild this upcoming season? Obviously, with the young guys, you'd like to, but if you're aiming for the playoffs, you're probably not going to play the young guys as much. So let me know your opinions. Obviously, each side has pros and cons. There are pros to making the playoffs this upcoming season. There are also cons. I think the pros of getting the young guys in and maybe not making the playoffs is weighs a little better than the cons of that. But that's purely opinion and skepticizing. Speculating. That's the word I've been looking for. Speculating. Purely speculating. So let me know who you think stays, who you think goes, who you think gets traded. If anyone gets traded, what's Bill Guerin going to do? He's got options. I don't know if any of them are necessarily good options. You got some guys on defense in the NHL that are about ready to come up. Do you trade anyone on the current defensive core if you can to get some of these younger guys to play, like Ryan O'Rourke? I don't know. Damian Hunt looks decent so far. Brock Faber will come up. Carson Lambos, he'll probably start the season in the Iowa Wild. Does he look good through the first couple of weeks and earn a call-up? We'll see. I don't know how trigger-happy Bill Guerin is when it comes to that stuff. I think he likes to wait for his players. Carson Lambos might see a full year in the AHL, and then next year looking to bringing him up as a full-time player. We'll see. I appreciate your thoughts. The Wild are an intriguing team throughout these buyouts, and it's one of the reasons I've been following them as closely as I have. But let me know what you guys think. Who do you bring back? Who do you trade? I appreciate you. Thank you for watching, and take care.